All right, guys, this is going to be our section where we are going to do geometry on a coordinate grid. So we call this coordinate geometry. So you know what a midpoint and distance is, okay, like length. So we're going to apply that to segments on a coordinate graph, okay, or coordinate grid. So the first thing that I want to talk about is midpoint, okay? There is a midpoint formula. So with midpoint, we're going to find the midpoint of these two pretty simple segments, A, B, and C, D. And we're going to discover the formula pretty quickly. Okay, so I've already marked the midpoint for each one. You know what a midpoint is, and so you can kind of just count on segment AB, 1, 2, 3, 4 units on the left, 1, 2, 3, 4 units on the right. And so the midpoint is going to be, get my pen. Uh, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 3. Okay, and we'll look into the actual coordinate and see how the formula arrives from that. So let's do the midpoint of CD. Again, I have it marked already. It is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 units long. And so you can see that there is 3 on this side, 3 on this side. So let's write that coordinate down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, -6, -1. Okay, so now let's kind of look at those coordinates and see how they're related. And so one thing to look at is this is our x value, this is an x value, and this is an x value. So you always want to kind of see how is the 6 related to those two right there, the 2 and the 10. How does 6 derive from 2 and 10? Well, if you look at 2 and 10, probably maybe what comes to mind is that 2 and 10 make 12. And how is the 6 related to the 12? Oh, we can divide that by 2. And so if you look at that in terms of the 3, okay, how is the 3 related to that 3 and that 3? Well, 3 plus 3 is 6. And when you divide 6 by 2, that gives you also 3. So let's make sure it works for the other ones as well. So -6 plus -6 is -12. When we take that -12 and divide by 2, we get -6 as well. And let's make sure that works for the other two coordinates. Okay, 2 plus -4, does that give us a -1? So 2 plus -4 is -2. -2 divided by 2 is -1. So see that pattern there is occurring for all of those coordinates. Okay, so your formula is going to look like this, where you add the two x values, which we'll call x1 and x2, and divide by 2. Same thing goes for the y values. We'll add the two y values and then divide by 2. So that's your midpoint formula that you're going to use to find the midpoint of any segment on a coordinate grid. Okay, so that's midpoint. We'll practice that here in a second. Let's now find a distance formula. Okay, how do you find the length of a segment? Okay, so it says find the length of segment AB by turning the segment into the hypotenuse of a right triangle. So let me get my pen. If I draw a segment going up and down, I have myself a right triangle. And you guys did Pythagorean theorem before in the past in middle school, and we did a little bit this year. So let me find the length of each side. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So the length of that piece is 8. And let's check this one here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's 7 right there. And so one thing to also look at when we look at these coordinates, which I wrote down for you, A is at -4, 2, and B is at 4, 9. Okay, and so when you look at the 8, you'll notice that it goes, the x value goes from -4 to +4. And so if you count, think of a number line from -4 to +4. That's 8 units, okay? And so that's something to think of right there. And then same thing for the y value. It goes from 2 up to 9. So how far or how many units is 2 away from 9? And then that's 7. Okay, so that's something to consider when we start thinking of the formula. But for now, let's do the Pythagorean theorem to find the length of AB, because that's how it's associated to the formula that we're going to use. Okay, so we're going to do 7 squared plus 8 squared equals C squared. Okay, C representing side AB. So then we have 49 plus 64 equals C squared. 49 plus 64 is, I believe it's 113. 49 plus 64, yes, 113 equals C squared. And then the last step to get C by itself, we are going to square root to get rid of that. And so C is going to equal, obviously this is going to be a decimal, so we'll round to 2 decimal places, 10.63, okay? So the length of AB is 10.63 units, okay? You could also technically leave it in radical form, but we'll have it in decimal, all right? And so how does this work in terms of a formula? Well, you have to square root, okay, 7 squared plus 8 squared. So we do have to square root 7 squared plus 8 squared, which the 7 and the 8 come from the actual coordinates, okay? This coordinate is x1, and this one can be x2. This one can be y1, and this one can be y2. So what do you do with those two? Well, if you subtract those two, that gives us that value, okay? So here's the actual formula that you get from, which is kind of from Pythagorean theorem. We're going to take x2 and subtract x1, and then we're going to square it. So remember, this is kind of like a squared plus b squared, and then we always have to take the square root at the end, so it's like we're square rooting that whole thing. Here's a picture right here at the bottom that kind of covers it a little bit better. So this horizontal length right here that I'm going to highlight in red, that horizontal length is represented by x2 minus x1. And then this vertical length is represented by y2 minus y1, okay? And so you just plug that into that formula. So these two formulas, guys, you do not have to memorize. You're going to have them on your notes, so you can always use those. You just have to make sure you plug in everything correctly. Okay, so let's try that real quick on this last example. So it says find the midpoint, okay? So remember, the midpoint is, all you want to do is you want to add the two x's, x1 plus x2 divided by 2, and then you want to do y1 plus y2 and divide that by 2. Okay, so let's add the two x's. That will be -8 plus 3, and we're going to divide that by 2. And then we're going to have 5, which is the y, add that with -9 and divide that by 2. So -8 plus 3 is -5. And then 5 plus -9 is -4. And so -5 divided by 2 is -2.5. You can use your calculator. And -4 divided by 2 is -2. So I'm going to go plot that point so you can see where it's at. So -2.5, 1, 2, and then a half, just go halfway, and down 2. So right there, that is the midpoint of that segment. Okay, and again, you just use the formula because you're not always going to have a picture. Sometimes we'll just give you word problems and you'll just use the formula. Okay, if you have a graph, then you can use that as well. Let's find the distance and the entire length of that segment. Okay, so I'm going to just use the formula. So remember, the formula goes like this: x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. So now we can, the points, guys, can be interchangeable. So if you call this one x1, y1, this one will be x2, y2. Now, your friend may have them flip-flopped and call 3, -9 x1, y1, and the other one x2, y2, and you will still get the same answer, okay? So just because you switch them, it doesn't matter. Okay, so let's plug in those numbers. x2, I ended up having it as 3 minus -8 squared plus, don't forget your square root. Every year, the students that forget to write the square root forget to square root at the end. y2, remember I had it down here, so -9 minus 5 and then squared. So don't forget that when you minus a negative, it becomes a plus. So this is like saying 11 squared. Don't forget the square root. Plus -9 minus 5 is -14. Notice you want to keep the parentheses over that, okay? And so this ends up being 121 plus -14 squared. A negative times a negative is a positive. So that's 196. Don't forget to always write your square root. 196 plus 121 is 317. Square root that. Again, you can use your calculator. And this is about 17.8. Okay, so the distance or the length of that segment is 17.8 units. Okay, oops, I misspelled that. All right, and that is midpoint and distance, just using the formula.